We are starting now. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Humans of the Ottoman Empire Talks. Today, we will be talking about Ottoman bureaucrats and then bureaucracy. And we are privileged, very privileged to have Dr. Carter Findley with us today, who is Humanities Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the History of Department at Ohio State University. And he is undisputedly one of the leading figures in Ottoman studies in the United States, and also he is one of the founders of Ottoman and Turkish studies in the United States. I'm going to introduce him a bit more in a minute, but before that, let me just remind you a few other things about this program. As you remember from our previous conversations and programs, this is a program, a talk series about Ottoman figures and humans, with public interest in mind. It is not necessarily an academic discussion on the issues that you are talking here. We are also very much interested in human stories. Nevertheless, we are also entertaining big questions about the subjects that we are dealing with. And today, we will be asking questions like, who were the Ottoman bureaucrats? After all, Ottoman Empire created one of the giant bureaucracy machines in history, in world history. And we are curious on who created that machine, which left us millions, if not tens of millions of documents to us today. And we historians are enjoying and working on them in the archives. Who were their educational or family background, and what was their biggest goal in the empire, and whether the sultans or sultanic power was curbed or limited by the bureaucrats, and who were the top Ottoman bureaucrats, and etc. So these are some of the questions that we will be looking at today with the help of Dr. Findley. As I said, Dr. Findley is one of the leading figures in the area in the United States, but in the whole world as well. And his area of research is the history of Islamic civilization, with emphasis on the Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East. He also co-founded Ohio State's World History Program, and he has numerous books and articles on various subjects. And his latest and very interesting book is called Enlightening Europe on Islam and Ottomans, Radko Dawson's and his masterpiece, published by Brill Press, Brill Publishing in 2019. And if the time permits, he may perhaps talk about it a bit later on. Carter Findley is also the author of a series of 2 books, which are quite relevant to today's discussion, on Ottoman administrative reform and development in the empire. The first book was Bureaucratic Reform in the Ottoman Empire, The Sublime Porte, 1789-1922. And the second book is called The Ottoman Civil Officialdom, A Social History. Both of them were published by Princeton University Press, respectively, and they are quite relevant to what we are talking today. And these books are still iconic books that we teachers are assigning to our students. Therefore, we are, again, very privileged to have Dr. Findley with us today to talk about Ottoman bureaucracy, bureaucrats, and reforms in the empire. Before I turn the table to him, just let me remind you a few things about our housekeeping items. As you remember, we do have a QA box. Please feel free to use that box for your questions. And I hope that we are going to allocate some time at the end of this conversation to answer your questions. Otherwise, please just feel free to use also chat to start a conversation among yourselves, or just to respond to each other's questions and queries. Last but not least, this is going to be a moderated discussion rather than Dr. Findley is going to give one big lecture. I will be jumping in once in a while, asking some questions, and then if I see fit, I can also make some comments here and there. So therefore, please just expect a moderated discussion in this series. So without further ado, now I would like to turn the table to Dr. Findley and start with his own story, because after all, we are very much interested in human stories, and then accordingly or fittingly, his story is very much of interest for us, and especially his interest into subject, how Dr. Findley, in other words, developed an interest into Ottoman studies in general and Ottoman bureaucracy in particular. Dr. Findley.
Well, the most efficient way to answer the question of how I got interested in bureaucracy was I was a graduate student back in the 60s at Harvard when Stanford Shaw was still there. And Sheriff Martin came to town to visit. And of course, he was a very impressive man, as anybody who ever met him knows. And one day, I was trying to decide what to select for a dissertation subject. And one day in Professor Shaw's office, he said to me, social scientists are very interested in bureaucracy nowadays. So I went and spent the next 25 years of my life working on bureaucracy. And the next time I saw him after that, I told him I had just spent 25 years of my life working on bureaucracy and what would he like me to do next? So that's the answer to that question.
Awesome, awesome. Then next question would be, of course, our main actors or agents in the Ottoman Empire, the bureaucrats. I mean, can you tell us, I mean, who were the Ottoman bureaucrats?
Who were they? Yes.
Yeah. Was there any specific identity or profession called as bureaucrats in the Ottoman Empire?
One of the things that interested me about Sheriff Martin was it seemed to me that he had very deep insights into the workings of Turkish society. Another person I think is like that is Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar.
Right.
And in their works, you feel like you're really seeing into the inner workings of Turkish society. And one of the fascinating things about the bureaucrats is to ask yourself where they came from. There was, until the foundation of the Mekteb-i Mülkiye in the 1850s, and it didn't even get big until after 1876, there was no school to train bureaucrats. So these people were people who had literary interests. In the Ottoman Empire, everybody wanted to be a poet. That was a prestigious form of intellectual production. So everybody wanted to be a poet. And if you really had the talent to be a poet, you were destined for a very unhappy life of the sort that Mustafa Ali of Gelibolu led.
Right.
And if you didn't have enough talent to be a real poet, you ended up working in the bureaucracy. So these were guys with basically, they were interested in what we might call the adab culture, the worldly literary culture. The formal education they got past the mekteb would have been in a madrasa, but of course a madrasa doesn't really train bureaucrats.
Right.
So then somehow they would find their way into a government office. They would also probably get interested in a Sufi order, one of the more learned ones. They would form patronage relationships with influential people who had a majlis at their house where people talked about interesting things. They would find ways to read manuscripts about subjects like geography and history. And of course, if they became writers, prose writers themselves, they would produce that kind of work. When I was growing up in the USA, people said, oh, why do you want to major in history? All you can do is teach. Well, the Ottoman Empire, if you were interested in adab culture and you didn't have the talent to become a real poet, then all you could do was become a katib. And so it was people like me, in essence, who ended up working in the bureaucracy. I think that's the best answer to that question.
Lovely, lovely. That's great. So basically, anyone who were illiterate could be potentially a bureaucrat in the Ottoman Empire
Oh
at the
no, not
center and of
illiterate.
not
No,
literate. I mean, yeah, I mean like
yeah,
literate.
you would be a highly literate person.
Right,
And of course, since there was no real school to train bureaucrats before
right.
the Abdul Hamid period or before the Tanzimat, you would have to get into the office as an apprentice. So probably after the Mektab, these guys at the age of 12 or 13, somewhere along in there, and oftentimes they were sons of bureaucrats. You know, learning at home was very important in the Ottoman Empire. And so they were probably apprenticed in the office. They would get in there with the sort of sponsorship of somebody. In some of the biographical dictionaries, it would be said that they got it with so-and-so's marifat, which what does marifat mean? It's a really unstable word.
Right.
Fulan efendinin marifetiyle şagird oldu. Something like that. Yeah, so they would have like a sponsor. Then they would be trained by apprenticeship. And there's a wonderful engraving in the Dosson book with an original artwork in the National Museum in Stockholm that shows the office, the Divani Humayun Kalemi, with the three tiers of clerks in there. The apprentices are sitting on low cushions with mustaches opposite the halifas, who are older men with full beards. And at the back of the room, you see the Raisul Kutab and his mumayas and his other supervisory officials sitting on either side of him. So you can see, and there's one of the illustrations in my new book is a perfect illustration of how they work. And it has, you can see the divits and the open death tears and the way they stored the documents in chests and boxes, and how they wrote holding the paper on their knee. It looks very difficult to do, but learning all those intricate insha things and the sort of formularies and honorifics and the du'as that you had to use after the names of people of different ranks and statuses, all that would have been on the job training.
Awesome.
So it really is very impressive and very highly literate.
Awesome. I mean, in the 19th and also 20th century too, people use those kind of governmental jobs as like, as a source of like social mobility. I mean, in pre-modern or pre-19th century times, I mean, people were also using it as a source of social mobility to use to go up in their career ladders. And was there any job security? I know this is an anachronistic question, but was there any job security for those bureaucrats in pre-modern times?
Well, before the Tanzimat, the biggest difference was made by your rank. From the Lale Devri on, it became possible for bureaucrats to rise all the way to the Grand Vizierate. This is this phenomenon of the Effendi turned Pasha that Norman Itzkowitz wrote the pioneering article about 60 years ago. And so that phenomenon started about the Lale Devri, but of course it has the trend was already beginning back in the time of Turhan Sultan, when she gave a building to the Grand Vizier, if that in fact is really historically what happened. That would be the origins of the Sublime Port, or at least of a headquarters for the Raisul Kutab outside of the palace. And so what was your question again? Catch me back up.
No, I was asking whether its relation to social mobility. Social
mobility.
mobility.
What I wanted to make was once it became possible for bureaucrats to rise all the way to be the Grand Vizierate. What made the difference was whether you were at or below the level of the Hajjagyan. The ordinary clerks in the offices, like that guy who started as an apprentice at the age of 12, you could have a 60-year career. And I have documents of people who did and never really got anywhere. And those guys had job security, but not much else.
Yes.
And once you get to the level of the supervisory officials, who were referred to in those days as the Hajjagani Divani Humayun, those guys were subjected from the 17th century on to the Tevjihat system, which means the annual appointments for 1 year at a time. And for the civil officials, or for the ulama, they came out at one time of the year, and for the of everybody else, they came out in the month of Shawwal, and everybody would just be on pins and needles during Ramadan because they were worried about what was going to happen to them. No, the point is to have it over before Ramadan. I guess that's the idea. Anyway, so once you got to be at the level of like the Race of Kutab or the Bash Defter Dar, you were part of this annual reappointment rotation. And those guys did not have job security. That was the level at which the idea of being the slave of the Sultan really could produce fatal consequences. And so that was politics. Below that, it was just administration. And one of the biggest differences between the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey was that politics all happened inside the administration. There was no politics, like no elections and no parliament until very late in the game. And so the politics all happened inside of the bureaucracy, but it really only was operative in its upper levels.
Perfect. Speaking of this, levels and hierarchies and whatnot, can you just give us a brief description of this whole system? Ottomans are famous and notorious even, like being quite paying attention to centralization and giving structure to institutions, and also keeping the hierarchy. So in this giant bureaucratic machine, who is at the top, and then who comes next, and how this pyramid and hierarchy of bureaucracy is working in the empire?
Well, it would have changed a good bit over the centuries. And of course, my deep research on bureaucracy was about the reform period from the accession of Selim III on. And now I'm working on a history of the Ottoman Empire, where I have to go back and read all of this stuff. And it really makes you realize how much it changed. It's very important, however, to realize that the Ottomans didn't invent all of this. The more we learn about the great Mongol Empire, which I had to study about when I was working on my book on the Turks and world history, the more we realize that a lot of these things that the Ottomans supposedly brought to the Middle East, the Mongols already did them. And if there had been something like a Mongol Başbakanlık arşivi that had survived, people would be doing the kind of studies about them. And even a word like defter, for example, which comes from Greek. The Mongols used the word debter with a B instead of an F. So a term, and if we think the Ottomans derived this from Greek, that's easy to understand. But how did the Mongols get it before the Ottomans ever had it, if the origins of the word are Greek? There's so much more out there that we don't realize. The other great source of this bureaucratic culture, which our katibs are learning on the job, in the Divani Humayun Kalemi and the other offices, a lot of it came from earlier Islamic states. Khalid ibn al-Juk, for example, had a lot to say about the importance of a Mamluk author about bureaucracy, Kalkashandi, and the influence of his work on Ottoman bureaucratic culture. There were big manuals of Insha and things like that the Ottoman katibs knew and studied. And also, if you think about the chaotic conditions in Anatolia in the late Seljuk and early Ottoman period, when you had the farthest possible opposite from centralization, it was a period of complete political disorganization, when little mini states were rising and falling all over the place. And imagine you're a katib looking for a job in that period. You would be every time your ruler got overthrown and killed, you would put your manuscripts into your saddlebag and get on your donkey and ride off looking for a new sultan to work for. And so there was a sort of a mobility of this culture.
Right.
And the more we learn about it, the more we realize that it has multiple sources. The the Ilkhanids who overshadowed the late Seljuks of Rum, that's also a big input, like the whole use of the Siakat script for financial records and the highly Persianate language content,
Right.
Siakat documents. That's clearly derived from the Ilkhanid practice. So these guys really, there was a lot of deep cultural roots that went very far back in multiple directions. And once inside, once this Ottoman bureaucracy began to take shape, it's important to realize that there were three big uh, pieces to it. One of them is the sort of in shop uh, culture that the kind of people who are oftentimes referred to as mektubi or mektubchu, the sort of correspondence, the prose writers who, you know,
Mhm.
who kept the, who recorded things in the Muhammad Defterleri and sent out the documents with all the required formularies to this ruler and that ruler and to the Bey of this province and the Qadi of that place.
Mhm.
These guys were the sort of prose writers. The monetary financial records were all, that was a different thing uh, that was in the offices of the Bash Dar. And those guys had to learn skills in things like accounting, financial record keeping, and the recording of all of this in this incredible Siakat script, where the prose part of it was written in this Kurma Divani, this sloppy Divani that's so hard to read. And then the third dimension of it was what became the Defteri Haqqani, the people who did the Tahrir surveys and kept those records. It overlaps in techniques and so forth a great deal with the financial records, but it is essentially separate in the sense that it's about the part of the it's about land tenure, which is not, you know, record that in terms of
Mhm.
Akhe or Karush.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Great.
so
I
there
mean,
were
actually,
big functional divisions within the Scrabble culture.
perfect. I was actually going to ask you about the roots of this Ottoman bureaucratic tradition. You already mentioned Ilkhanids and Mughals and Islamic, and not to mention, of course, like Roman and Byzantine too, right? And that would be also the case almost in all other Ottoman traditions and institutions. That roots are there. That Ottomans did not necessarily invent everything out of blue, but transferred them or integrated those traditions into their own bodies, but then they modified, changed, or excelled in it. And speaking of which, I mean, was there any Ottoman invention or contribution, or the way that they dealt with things differently within this, bureaucratic tradition in the Ottoman times?
Well, uh, I, I think that question is impossible to answer
Yeah.
unless one knows as much about, say, the other Islamic
Right.
empires as about the Ottoman Empire. What
Right.
I can tell you is that the Ottoman Empire survived, and after the collapse of the Safavids in the early 1700s, Iran didn't have a central government again until the rise of the Qajars, and even in the Qajars, the ministers still had no fixed place of doing business. The records don't survive.
Mhm.
In India, the Mughal Empire, which surely had a very highly developed Perso-Islamic bureaucratic
Yeah.
culture, again, the same sort of thing happened by the 1700s. The Ottoman Empire is the place where this Islamic tradition of statecraft, state formation, survived
Mhm.
and lasted. Its evolution continued right up until the closing of the Sublime Porte in November of 1922.
No, excellent. I mean, that would be perhaps one of the explanations why we today ended up having again millions, if not tens of millions of documents,
Oh,
crafted
for
and
sure,
written in Ottoman
yes.
Empire, which was kind of very not unique, but it's a very important thing to recognize, especially in reference to other Islamic empires.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. In fact, one of the reasons I went into Turkish studies as opposed to some other branch of Middle Eastern studies was because my professor at the time told me that there were these archives in Turkey. And at that stage, it was the only place where archives were open in any significant way. There are, of course, major documentary collections in Egypt, but access to them is a lot more difficult. And not all of those archives were organized and open at that stage.
Right.
Abdul Karim Rafik did heroic work in getting the sigilat of Aleppo and Damascus all brought together in Damascus. Right. And who knows what's happened to that now. But anyway, yeah, when I was a student, if you wanted to be a historian about anything to do with the Middle East, Istanbul was essentially the place to go.
Yes, speaking of, those documents were produced definitely at the central, places, central big cities, and then central government, the area of central government, but also apparently those documents were also produced in the provincial areas and by the provincial governments too, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And of course, the way people accomplished this would have varied a lot in different periods. From the 17th century on, once this era of decentralization sets in and you're headed off towards the Ayan system of the 18th century,
right?
As Metin Kunt found years ago, to be considered qualified for a provincial government, you had to have a Mükemmel Kapı, which meant you had an entourage of maybe hundreds of people, many of whom were military. So you would ride off to the provinces. In the Dosson book, there's one of his engravings depicts a provincial governor on his way to a new appointment. And the procession is so long that he has to make it go winding back and forth as if it was going up a mountain road, when in fact it's going across a flat plain. So he has to make it twist back and forth in hairpin turns, just in order to show these hundreds of people in one picture. And in the middle, sitting on the horse with a banner over him, is the new Vali. And of course, a lot of these people would have been military, but he would have for sure had some mektub to work for him. And so, yeah, there would have been a provincial outpost for doing it. And obviously, there were people who learned this culture in provincial sites.
Great. You kind of answered this question, but it doesn't hurt to just, repeat that again. Who created this giant machine again? And who are the main actors who are creating and also perpetuating this system?
Well, once again, if we knew more about the Mongols, we wouldn't be thinking it was the Ottomans who did this. It seems to be, if you ask me, it's something about the dynamics of life in Eurasia. All across, Americans can imagine that you can really live independently. And I think the state of New Hampshire, the state motto is live free or die. Well, if you're a peasant in the Yangtze Delta of China or nomad out on the steppes of Central Asia, it would be live free or die. It would be live free and die. You really needed some kind of power, organization of power. And for people who came out of Central Asia, I think I had a chance finally to go to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and I think one of the things I got out of this is this sense, they're out there. We think of Central Asia as being steppes, and a lot of it is quite flat. But of course, there are also a whole lot of mountains. A lot of it is also mountainous, and so when you had these wide open spaces with mountains off in the distance, you had this sense of an enormous sky overhead. And the idea that rulership or the right to rule or the power to rule is up there in the sky, just waiting for somebody who's strong enough to take it.
Right,
Just
right.
being in the environment makes you realize how people could think that. And Tangri is really right up there. And
Right, right, right.
if you're the man of destiny, if it's your turn, your your Dala in the original sense of the word, is if it's your turn of fortune, you and the techniques and implements of step empire formation had been invented by already before the Turks first appear in history. It goes back to the Xiongnu period. What it took to create a step empire among nomadic populations. So the techniques for doing it and the political advantages of doing it were already there in prehistoric times. And then when the Turks appear in history in the Chinese sources from the 6th century, they very quickly emerge, first as one ruling clan, then as their followers, then as a term that applies to other people who actually don't have that much in common with them to start with.
Right.
I mean, our initial descriptions of the Kyrgyz say they have, I don't know, what was it, yellow hair and green eyes or something like that. And the Chinese, they don't sound right at all. And, and somehow Turkish identity spreads from this very small beginning out to something that extends from from Siberia to the Balkans.
No, great. I mean, we world historians are always like making an emphasis on interconnectedness of histories. And now you are telling us that, Ottoman tradition, bureaucratic tradition, and also other traditions that could not be understood well without making references to other civilizations. And no civilization was born in isolation. And that is, of course, the case for not only Ottoman Empire, but also European civilization or Islamic civilization or Central Asian civilizations. I mean, we always need to see things in an interconnected fashion. And I think your point is quite valid in that regard in understanding Ottoman bureaucracy.
From my point of view, one of the most interesting things that I've learned out of this new project I'm doing now, where I'm trying to write a history of the Ottoman Empire, one of Halil İnalcık's great contributions was to point out that what he called the Çifthanesi system,
right.
That the Ottoman agrarian economy was really based on this idea of the small family farm. The amount of land that one family could farm, and it becomes the sort of like cell, the micro level of both economic production, biological reproduction of the population, and revenue generation. And this system goes back to the way the Byzantines, and before them, the Romans, had organized the agrarian economy of the Mediterranean world. So here is something that goes back, centuries before the Ottomans. And it really doesn't, in that sense, it has nothing to do to start, well, Islam is not even there yet. So it obviously can't have anything to do with Islamic civilization. It's one of the pre-existing inputs. But then in the Ottoman Empire, the way they kept track of all of this and the way the bureaucrats kept the records on this was by using this Tahrir system with all of the Siakat and the Persianized language of the Siakat documents that they got from the Ilkhanids. So they used a Mongol-derived record-keeping system to keep track of a land tenure and agrarian economy system that they inherited from the Byzantines and the Romans.
Oh,
that to me is a fascinating example of how the origins reach off in all different directions.
And also continuity, perhaps, right? That you're talking about.
Yeah,
continuity in traditions. Absolutely. I mean, we are now facing again a very, very, very efficient system of record keeping in the empire. But in terms of efficiency, I'm just wondering, this Ottoman bureaucracy, was it an efficient system to deal with the issues? People are going to courts, or they might have some issues with the state. So when anyone in the empire had an issue with the state, could they get the result efficiently, or they had to wait, like in a Kafkaesque world there you send your petition but you never get an answer? I mean, again, the question was about the efficiency of the system. How was it efficient or not?
There will never be a final answer to that question.
We just speculate on things.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things I ever found was this huge manuscript, something like 2,500 pages in Ottoman Turkish. It's the biography, no, the autobiography of a naive bureaucrat, a guy named Ibrahim Halil, who was and the manuscript describes it as the memoirs of a dervish, which he was. I mean, he was really into joining whatever order had the biggest presence wherever he was. And he had jobs in different places all around the empire. He's one of these guys who was apprenticed in the offices about the age of 12. And he was already playing muezzin and as a little boy before that. Grew up somewhere in Istanbul, Süleymaniye area, I think. Was apprenticed as about 12 and had a 60-year career and never got very high up. And he lived through everything. There were times in Damascus when his salary wasn't being paid and Ramadan was coming, and what were they going to do for the Bayram? And they were so worried about everything. And so so you realize how much the financial problems created pressures that could corrupt even the most honest kind of a guy. And there were other times when he complained about how much work there was. They were understaffed, and people were demanding this and that and the other from him. And one of the expressions he uses, one time he felt like a man who had fallen off a ship into the sea and didn't know which way to swim to try to get to shore. He was, in other words, drowning in work. So he thought there was a lot of efficiency in the Ottoman bureaucratic system. But for people who had a problem in any given place in time, well, there were things they could do. They had recourses. They could, go to the local county court. If they didn't like one county court, they could go to a different one. They shopping courts was something they did. They could also send a petition to the center. And if you look at the records from the center, you get the impression that the Divani Humayun was really on the job and was trying to inquire into things at the micro level, down in Aleppo or wherever it was, and really press for an answer and demand an explanation, all this kind of stuff. And yet the distances and the slowness of communication was such that you have to wonder what really happened on the ground. And I think this is one of the problems about studying the financial records. From Linda Darling's study of the financial records of the 17th century, you get the impression that they were just incredibly efficient. They're concerned above anything else about the fairness and justice of the system, which shows up, that idea shows up in the Tanzimat as well. And yet at the same time, if you look at the other records about the taxation system of the period, you realize it was full of all kinds of variations across space and time. All kinds of population groups were exempt from this tax or that tax because they were supposed to guard a pass here or a bridge somewhere else, or supply horses to the cavalry or do something like that. So it was full of all kinds of inconsistencies, which were there for a purpose, but they would have made it look, it was certainly a very inequitable system in the sense that it didn't impact everybody the same. It wasn't really supposed to, but it certainly didn't. So there were always people who had things to complain about where the taxes were concerned.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of the purpose of the system, I mean, I know this is another speculative question, but if I ask you, what was the ultimate goal of, say, that system, that bureaucratic system? What did they really want to achieve overall? like to keep the order, or just they had some other goal in mind, you'd say?
Well, obviously it changed a lot over the centuries, and as you know, it got so much bigger over time.
Absolutely.
And certain events had sort of head-turning consequences for the people at the top of the system. The conquest of Constantinople, for example, got Mehmed the Conqueror interested in all kinds of things about the sort of non-Islamic parts of the empire, and being the heir of the Caesars and Caesari Rum and all of this kind of stuff.
Right.
And then after that, I mean, to say that Bayezid II, his son, turned things back and was a reactionary, well, hey, they needed a change of tune after that. Also, they needed somebody who would reverse some of Mehmed the Conqueror's excessively stiff-armed, centralizing reforms, which had had a very harsh impact on religious institutions and a lot of other interests. When you get to Suleiman the Magnificent, once again, in the early period when he's got this Grand Vizier who was over there from a place on the Dalmatian coast, Parkal Ibrahim Pasha. In that first 10 years of Suleiman's reign, you go through the same thing again, and of course it's magnified by the conquest of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and the first siege of Vienna in 1529. Well, talk about events with head-turning consequences. All of a sudden, Suleiman the Magnificent, he doesn't just rule the capital of the Caesars. He also really is a big player in European politics. So once again, there's this sort of head-turning thing where they're dabbling in all kinds of stuff like European symbolism of sovereignty and stuff like that. Then after the execution of Ibrahim for the last 40 years, Suleiman's own reign turns back in a much more strongly Islamic orientation. So what people are trying to do changes a lot, but in the long run, the sort of North Star, if you want, for the Islamic political cultures has been the idea of justice. It is one reason, I mean, it is what rationalizes living under an authoritarian sultan. You know, this guy is so high above everybody else that supposedly he can be impartial about the problems of ordinary people. Well, that's what we hope anyway. And so
in that regard, could sultans be limited or curbed by bureaucracy or bureaucratic system in your mind?
Well, it was more like, I would say it was more likely that the bureaucrats could curb the sultan by just, you know, I think it was bureaucratic complexities and what the Turks call kırtasiyeçilik, the stationery business, red tape. The Persian word is kağıtbazı, playing with paper. The Greek word is graphokrateia, rule by writing. So kırtasiyeçilik could impede the impact of the sultan's reforms. But in terms of wanting to limit his power or debate about it, I would say it was more likely to ulama who would be doing this, because in the area of justice, you have these competing ideas that justice means enforcing the Sharia on one hand, or in the sort of Persian-derived, I guess also Mongol-derived tradition, it is enacting a sort of justice that comes down from on high. It's the unfettered discretion of this ruler who's placed so high above everybody else that dispenses justice. And in this case, it's identified more with what the Mongols call Teret, and the Turks knew as Kanun. So it depends. There's a sort of tension that's always there. But I think those are the sort of main inputs that go into it.
Yeah, we don't want to get into this whole discussion of Oriental despot, but let's just keep that for another discussion.
Yeah, I don't know much about that. I gotta say, in terms of Weber's own ideas about bureaucracy, this may not make sense, but it was not all there in English when I was actually first working on it. It was only later that the entire body of his Economy and Society was published in English by Roth and Wittig. And so actually it took me, I was very late in the game to discover that when Weber is writing about bureaucracy, he's actually not writing about systems like the Ottoman Empire at all. In his vocabulary, bureaucracy is modern bureaucracy, like in Germany. And what the Ottomans had is what he calls patrimonial officialdom.
Right.
So social scientists kept telling me I should read Weber about bureaucracy. I kept reading it, it kept not helping me. And only years later, by the time I was doing my second book, the Rotten-Wittig translation had come out. Right. And I could see that what I admit was missing was what he called patrimonial officialdom.
Okay. I mean, we promised our guests not to get into technical details of the discussions, therefore I just try to like avoid from big names and jargons. But I totally understand the fact that Weberian or like European say perception.
Well, if you want to connect this with my own books,
right.
My second book in particular, The Ottoman Civil Officialdom, is about the transition from the old type of captive culture, which that's Weber's patrimonial officialdom, to trying to create something like a modern bureaucracy. Whether the Ottomans ever really got there or not is an open question. But even in Europe, they were not behind chronologically. Even in Europe, the idea of having what we think of as civil service today, the European or American ideas of what the Turks called or civil officials, that was a 19th century invention anywhere. Yeah, before that, being a clerk was a low status job in France or anything like that. And so the Ottomans were not, they were pretty much chronologically in line with other countries in trying to make this transition to what we think of as modern bureaucracy.
Great. I mean, actually, your book and books, showed us, in detail how in the 19th century Ottomans have reformed themselves in many areas and then refashioned themselves and created almost a modern state, not only at the level of bureaucracy, but also in other areas as well that we know for sure now. Remaining like 5 minutes actually, I would like to ask you 2 more questions and then maybe have a few other questions coming from guests too. One question was about the place of non-Muslims in Ottoman bureaucracy. Maybe this is more of the case in the 19th century. Can you say a little bit about the role or place of non-Muslims in the Ottoman bureaucracy?
Well, really, if you're talking about the bureaucracy of the state, before the 19th century, before the Tanzimat, there really were just a few places around the edges where it was sort of like the a miniature of the millet system inside the government apparatus, particularly for the Greeks or the Greek Orthodox, which was the biggest non-Muslim group and the most powerful. And really did. There were 4 of these positions. The patriarch, the translator of the imperial divan.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry, the patriarch is not really part of the bureaucracy. The translator of the imperial divan, the translator for the navy, and the governors or princes of Wallachia and Moldavia, these 2 Romanian principalities that were vassal states of the Ottoman Empire. There was those 4 were sort of like there was a ladder of promotion even among them to some degree, and they had each of them had a huge household. You know, talk about this mechanical idea, the idea that you had to have a huge entourage to do your job. So there would have been hundreds of people living off of these guys and getting, getting rich off of them. And they were sort of at the edge of the government. Muslims before the Tanzimat or before the 1790s anyway, would not learn European languages or weren't supposed to. So they had to rely on non-Muslims as translators, and that was what validated and created these positions for the two non-Muslim translators. After the Tanzimat, the British, for example, who, of course, they had only passed the British Reform Law in the 1830s. So before then, if you were not a member of the Church of England, you couldn't even graduate from the university, let alone, I mean, it wasn't just Jews who were in this position. It was people like Quakers or Baptists or Catholics, God forbid. That was one of the worst things, was to be a Catholic. That would help us. And so the British had barely changed those laws in their own country before they started putting pressure on the Ottomans to do the same thing. So the Ottomans in 1839 began to do this. And so during the Tanzimat, you have this phenomenon of recruiting non-Muslims into the bureaucracy.
Right.
And they tended to sort of show up in certain places. The foreign ministry, because it did a lot of its business in French, which was the diplomatic language of the day, they had one of the offices in particular, the Tahrirati Haraji Academy, the Foreign Correspondence Office, which produced correspondence in French. That turned into an Armenian enclave. Another office was called the Terjüme Odası, so the translation office, which translated documents from other languages into Ottoman Turkish. That was full of Muslims. So you had this kind of phenomenon, and eventually these guys could get to be pashas too. So in the up through the Young Turk period, there is a good bit of this. And really, and even under the early republic, as you know, there were Greeks in the Turkish parliament not until 1955. So some of it survived by the empire, but it was a 19th century egalitarian push.
Correct.
And the pressure for it increased after the Crimean War with the Reform Decree of 1856.
Perfect. My last question to you was about the legacy, Ottoman bureaucratic legacy in modern times, since you are also an expert on modern Middle East. I mean, in a good or bad way, what is the Ottoman bureaucratic legacy in modern Turkey or in the larger Middle East or even in the Balkans? I mean, can you speculate on that?
I just got in contact with an old college classmate of mine who was born in Jerusalem. And he informed me that he's an Arab from Jerusalem, and he informed me that his grandfather was an officer in the Ottoman army and liked the Ottomans, and his grandmother said no, she didn't like the Ottomans. She thought they were corrupt and all those bad things. And which was it? And he asked me which I thought it was, and I answered to him, maybe both your grandparents were right.
Yeah. Okay.
There was a lot about it that was good, but it was it was not a perfect system. And in terms of its legacy, the most important thing about it, to create a modern bureaucracy, you have to have people, and you have to have procedures, and you have to have an organizational and regulatory apparatus. So you're going to have rules and regulations, you're going to have procedures, and you're going to have personnel and ways to train them. And that means you're going to end up with things like having a law about the recruitment and retention and retirement of officials, which that's one of the laws of I think it's sort of like the 1870s, maybe early on. You're going to need a system of personnel records Sigilia file, dosya, as they were called, created under Abdul Hamid.
Right.
All of these things are rational ways of organizing, running things. And in terms of the legal apparatus, the Tanzimat is the period when the production of Qanun really did revive. And they began publishing the Dusturs in the middle 1850s, I think, and it became really systematic in the Hamidian period. For working on the bureaucracy in that stage, in addition to the archival documents I had gathered, the Dustur was the main thing I had to go to, and that's where I really found that's the organizational and legal apparatus taking shape. And so in terms of what the Ottomans left to the later world, it's these structures. And so there are places where the Mejelle, for example, this legal compilation put together by Cevdet Pasha in the Tanzimat period, there are countries where that still applies. And Israel is still used in cases involving the Muslim population. And in other places, like I think in Iraq, there were other successor states where it survived for a long time. So this legal apparatus and the legal culture. And one of the important writers on Clement Dodd in England, who wrote a lot about politics and administration in the early republic, said that the formation of the republic was evolutionary, not revolutionary. Okay. You know, they didn't even need a new constitution immediately.
Okay, awesome.
So there was a huge inheritance, and I think finally one of the most significant things about late Ottoman history is the fact that they created a local administration staffed by civilians. That's what the Mulkiya, Memor Ladut, that's what that means. Civil administrators. And I think one reason why the Turkish politics, whatever's good or bad about it, it at least is not as chaotic and is dominated by the military as you see in the Arab countries. This may be a finding of really world historical importance, I think. It has to do with the fact that the Ottomans actually created, it's the first place, I believe it's the first place in Islamic history where a local administration staffed by civilians was created. From the time of the early Islamic conquests on, those military towns, the Amsar as they're known in Arabic, those were essentially military bases out in countries where most of the population was still non-Muslim, obviously. And over time, a lot of it became Islamized. But I think it is one reason why the politics of the Arab world is still dominated by the military.
Right.
And of course, the military had a big place. You can talk about Qadi as having an important administrative role, but it actually, it's secondary to their primal function. A lot of administrative work was assigned to Qadis because they were out there, and you know, they could register the documents at the local level and read them to the people at the court, so that is a way of informing the public. But I think this is, if you want a legacy from the Ottomans, the fact that they created a local administration staffed by civilians.
That's very important.
And didn't happen until the Tanzimat period. It is one of the biggest legacies and one of the biggest differentiators in the state of things in the Middle East today.
That's a great point. I mean, I am going to get two questions from the audience, and then we are going to wrap up our fascinating discussion and conversation on the Ottoman bureaucrat and bureaucracies. One of our guests, actually, Rona T, asks rather, how did the central government control the cities? She's asking for, I think she's asking, you know, the governance of a city in particular.
Well, I wish I felt qualified to answer that question. This new project of mine, you know, this is a topic that has a very long and very unhappy history. People used to write books about what they call the Islamic city. And this kind of goes back to the Weberian world of typing things. And of course, for somebody like Bernard Lewis, the idea that the city did not have a corporate identity was the big thing that was wrong with the Islamic world as opposed to the West. It was one of those reasons why the Middle East fell behind and all that kind of stuff. And all I can tell you is if there is one topic on which understandings and ideas are in flux, I would say it is that one. And because you introduced me as an expert on bureaucracy, and so I could take a pass and excuse myself for not having a good answer about that. I don't think there is a good answer to give yet. We're discovering there's a whole lot more variation among them. And whether or not they had a sort of corporate identity like the European towns and cities, maybe that's not even the most important question. There's the more salient question is to ask what sort of urban institutions there were and how they function. When I think about social history, I try to start with an individual. I imagine myself living in say, Aleppo in the 16th century, and then I ask myself, who would have been around me? And I sort of try to branch out and figure what was there, like, your family, your clan, maybe there's a tribe off in the distance somewhere. Then whatever your profession is, probably I'm a member of a guild. And so I hang out with the other tanners or there's other shoemakers. And then there's a religious identity. There's a local mosque and local imam. Maybe there's a Sufi order that I'm affiliated with. And you should sort of try to branch out from there and figure out how your world is structured. And then I think the fact is there's a good bit of variation from place to place and time to time. Between Aleppo and Damascus, for example, which of the Janissary factions was on which side? It's the opposite in one place and the other, according to the research I've seen.
Okay, one last question to entertain. Emperor's family, Sultanic family, were they employed by the state?
Well, they were, in some senses, they were treated as if they were, because they were assigned large incomes. At least the people who had were really close to the Sultan, like his leading concubines, the mothers of his children, his daughters and sisters. The Shehzades were treated very badly once they were confined inside the palace. They certainly didn't get much. But they were on the payroll. So there were financial offices, for example, where they were keeping records about their incomes. But it's really a royal family type of situation where the Sultan, of course, is the head of the family. And of course, the Valideh Sultan, his mother, if she survives, she is really the senior member of the imperial household, even though it's going to be a man who dominates. And so she is always going to address her son as Aslanım or something like that, my lion. And she will tell him what to do to the extent she can. But in the last analysis, he's the person who issues the orders. And so that's the way things really work inside the dynasty. The imperial household, of course, is a huge entourage with a number of eunuchs who guard the gates, the number of pages inside the third court, the number of women inside the imperial harem. These run up in, and then you've got these other outer services like the stables and the kitchens, which have hundreds of people working in those. And further out, there's the mint, the Darbhana is out there at the outer edges of the palace, and you've got huge military contingents out in the outer courtyards. So it's really a colossal household, and a lot of the inner workings of it, a lot of these people have got really minor jobs. The women inside the imperial harem, for example, they were organized in the same way as the low status bureaucrats, or for that matter, the apprentice journeyman master hierarchy of the guilds, Shagird, Khalfa, and Usta. You get that
Mhm.
sort of hierarchy is replicated even in the at the lower levels inside the imperial harem. So it's a huge organization, and the people at the top, it's really the sultan who assigns these favors and
Right.
incomes to people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, it was really a great honor to have you, Dr. Findley. And it is really, fascinating to talk to a world historian who is able to put even small stories in the larger context. I mean, you really take us from like Central Asia to Middle East to Balkans and all the way to England, and then, made us to see things in the larger context. And thank you very much indeed. And I hope our, audience also enjoyed listening to you and learning from you too, and hope to see you in another occasion. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you very much.